Jake Matthews wasn't the kind of boy who stood out in a crowd. He wasn't particularly athletic or the most popular kid at school. At 12 years old, he was more of an observer, someone who preferred reading or sketching in his notebook over playing video games or hanging out with friends. Growing up in a modest home with a single mother, Laura, Jake had learned early on that life wasn't about things. It was about people, and that understanding shaped everything about him. Laura worked tirelessly, juggling 2 jobs. One as a waitress at a local diner, the other as a cleaning lady at an office building downtown. Despite her best efforts, they never seemed to make enough to escape the weight of their financial struggles. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, and sometimes Jake would see the exhaustion in his mother's eyes when she returned home late at night. But Laura was strong. She always had a smile for him, always reassured him that everything would be okay, even when things didn't feel okay. And Jake believed her. The one thing Jake wished for more than anything was to see his mother happy, to see her not just survive, but live a life she could enjoy, one where she didn't feel worn out by the demands of multiple jobs. He dreamed of a future where they didn't have to worry about their next meal or how to pay rent. It wasn't much, just a small, quiet wish to make things better for the woman who had given everything for him. On this particular afternoon, Jake had just finished his homework and was heading home from the library, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The sky was a soft blue, the kind of peaceful color that made everything feel serene, and he took his time, enjoying the walk through the woods that bordered their town. The path was his favorite part of the day. It wasn't the quickest route, but it was the most beautiful. He could hear the rustling of the leaves in the breeze, the soft chirping of birds, and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. He liked being alone in nature, feeling connected to something larger than himself. But as he pedaled his bike through the winding path, something shattered the tranquility. It was the sound of screeching tires followed by a sharp, jarring crash. Metal on metal, a loud thud, and the sickening sound of something breaking. Jake's heart leaped into his throat. The noise echoed through the trees, and before he could process what had happened, he was already on his way toward it. As he approached the clearing, his stomach twisted. A luxury sedan, sleek and shiny, was wrapped around a tree, the front crumpled and smoke rising from under the hood. The glass from the shattered windshield glinted in the fading sunlight like shards of ice. For a moment, Jake froze. His first instinct was to turn around, to run back home where it was safe. But he couldn't. He'd heard the crash. Someone might be hurt. He jumped off his bike and rushed toward the wreckage, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced. Was the driver alive? Could he help? But all those thoughts vanished the moment he saw the man behind the wheel. The driver was slumped over, unconscious, his face pale and covered in blood. His arms were twisted at an awkward angle, and the seatbelt had dug into his chest, trapping him. The car was tilted at a dangerous angle, and Jake could smell the faint hint of gasoline leaking from the engine, a smell that made his skin prickle with fear. What do I do? Jake thought frantically. Without hesitating, he pulled off his jacket and ran to the driver's side, trying to get a better look. He could hear the car's engine sputtering, and the air around him felt thick and heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. His hands shook as he reached for the door handle, but the door wouldn't budge. The frame was dented too badly. Jake's stomach churned. He had to act fast. The smoke was thickening, the car starting to burn from within. He couldn't just stand there. He looked around, noticing a small rock near the front tire. With trembling hands, he grabbed it and used it to smash the side window. The glass shattered, falling to the ground with a sharp crack. He quickly reached through, pulling the door handle from the inside. The door creaked open just enough for Jake to slip his body through. Inside, the man's face was even worse than he had imagined. Blood matted his hair, and his breath came in shallow gasps. His chest was rising and falling irregularly, but he was alive. Jake could see that much. That was the good news. The bad news was that the man was stuck. Jake didn't hesitate. He reached over and tried to unbuckle the man's seatbelt, but his hands were trembling too much. It took a few attempts, but he finally managed to undo the strap, just as a small flame flickered near the engine. He yanked the man toward him, pulling his limp body out of the car and onto the grass. The man groaned in pain as Jake dragged him away from the wreckage. His heart raced as he looked over his shoulder. He could see the flames creeping up the front of the car, licking at the edges of the windshield. The fire would engulf it soon. "Stay with me," Jake whispered, though he wasn't sure if the man could hear him. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Adrenaline surged through Jake's veins as he tried to keep the man still, hoping he hadn't caused any further injury. Within seconds, the paramedics arrived, pulling up with their sirens wailing. They rushed to the scene, taking over the situation. Jake stepped back, his heart still racing, his hands covered in blood, his legs shaky from the exertion. One of the paramedics gave him a thankful nod, then turned to the man. "You did a good thing," he said. But Jake didn't need their praise. He wasn't looking for thanks. He was just glad he had been there, just glad he had been able to help. That was all that mattered. As the ambulance drove away, Jake stood alone in the clearing, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He'd done something brave today, something that had truly mattered. He didn't know who the man was or what kind of life he led, but he'd saved him, and that was enough. When Jonathan Hale opened his eyes in the sterile hospital room, everything felt distant and foggy. He wasn't sure where he was, but the dull ache in his head and the tightness in his chest told him something serious had happened. His mind wandered, trying to piece together the fragments of memory, but they felt out of reach, like a dream slipping through his fingers. A few moments later, a nurse came into the room, checking his vitals. Her expression was kind, but professional. "You're lucky to be alive," she said quietly. "A young boy pulled you from the wreckage just in time." The words barely registered. A boy? Jonathan blinked, his thoughts still blurry. The last thing he remembered was driving down that quiet road, thinking about the next big deal, the next conference. His life had always been about the next step, business, growth, more. It was all about the climb. The nurse must have noticed the confusion in his eyes because she gently continued, "He saved you. He's the one who kept you from going into shock and got you out before the car exploded. You owe him everything." Jonathan frowned, trying to focus. He had never been the kind of man who placed much value on sentiment. To him, people were assets, investments, or obstacles to overcome. He hadn't really cared about anyone outside of his business, his own empire. His world was filled with boardrooms, numbers, and deadlines. People came and went, but the company was always the constant. The idea of a boy saving him, someone so young, felt strange, unfamiliar. He didn't know why, but he was shaken by the thought. Hours later, Jonathan was finally able to sit up in bed, still dizzy but more alert. A doctor came in to check on him, asking if he needed anything, and Jonathan shook his head, staring out the window. There, in the distance, he saw the hospital staff moving about, and he wondered, who was this boy? What did he want? The next day, when Jonathan was deemed well enough to leave, he was told the boy, Jake Matthews, had been waiting to speak to him. Jonathan wasn't sure what to expect. What could a child possibly want from him? A millionaire tech mogul who had everything. But when Jake walked into the room, Jonathan was taken aback. Jake wasn't the type of boy you'd expect to be a hero. He was smaller than Jonathan had imagined, his face round with youth, his eyes wide with uncertainty. He seemed awkward in the sterile hospital environment, looking as out of place as Jonathan felt. His clothes were simple, worn jeans and old t-shirt, and his hands were clasped nervously in front of him. "Mr. Hale?" Jake said softly, his voice betraying his nervousness. Jonathan nodded, still in a daze. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I didn't mean to." He trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Jonathan studied him for a moment, trying to place this boy who had saved his life. There was something about Jake's quiet confidence that unsettled him. It wasn't the bravado of a hero looking for attention or reward. No, Jake had done what he did out of instinct, without any thought of what he might gain. "Thank you," Jonathan said, his voice sounding foreign to him. Gratitude wasn't a feeling he was accustomed to expressing. "You saved my life." The words felt clumsy coming from him, but they were true. Jake shrugged, almost embarrassed by the attention. I did what anyone would do, right?" he said almost to himself. Jonathan was struck by the boy's humility. Not everyone would have. "I'm lucky you were there." There was a pause as Jonathan looked at Jake. wondering if the boy knew what kind of world he was dealing with. Jonathan had built his fortune in the ruthless world of tech startups. He had no qualms about taking risks, playing hardball, and making deals that would turn heads or break hearts. And yet, here was Jake, standing before him, so different from the business people Jonathan was used to interacting with. This boy wasn't interested in profit or power. He didn't want a piece of Jonathan's world. He just wanted to help. It was humbling in a way that Jonathan couldn't quite place. Jake shifted uncomfortably, breaking Jonathan from his thoughts. "Look, Mr. Hale," he said, his voice quieter now. "I don't want anything from you. I mean, my mom's been wanting to open a cafe for years now, but she can't afford it, you know? I thought if you could just help her get started, that would be enough. She's always worked so hard, and I want to see her happy." Jonathan stared at him, surprised. He had expected the boy to ask for something, a reward for his bravery, perhaps. Money, fame, a scholarship. But Jake's request was so simple, so unassuming, that it caught Jonathan off guard. He didn't want anything for himself. All he wanted was a chance for his mother to live out her dream. "That's it?" Jonathan asked, incredulous. Jake nodded, his eyes earnest. "Yeah, I just want to see her happy, you know. She deserves it." Jonathan was speechless. It was a stark contrast to the deals he made every day, deals that revolved around numbers, leverage, and power. He had spent his life building an empire based on competition and calculation. And here was Jake, a child, asking for nothing more than the fulfillment of his mother's simple dream. "Of course," Jonathan said after a long moment. "I'll help you. We'll get your mother's cafe started." Jake blinked, surprised by the answer. "Really?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "Really?" But then something occurred to him, and he added, "But I think there's something else you can do for me. I could use someone like you, someone who thinks about more than just profit. How would you like to help me with some of my business decisions? I could use a fresh perspective." Jake hesitated, unsure of what Jonathan meant. He wasn't a businessman, wasn't interested in numbers and meetings. But there was something in Jonathan's voice, an invitation, almost something that intrigued him. "Okay," Jake said after a pause. "I'll help." Jonathan smiled. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was making the right choice. Maybe, just maybe, Jake Matthews had the ability to change more than just the future of his mother's cafe. The days following their first meeting felt surreal to Jake. He couldn't quite wrap his head around the fact that he had saved a millionaire's life. The man in the hospital bed, Jonathan Hale, wasn't just any rich person. He was a mogul, a titan of the tech world, someone whose name Jake had seen in the business section of the newspaper, someone whose influence reached far beyond anything Jake had ever known. And yet, despite everything Jonathan had achieved, despite the endless wealth and power at his disposal, it was Jake, a 12-year-old boy, who had saved him from the wreckage. Jonathan's promise to help his mother open a cafe hadn't felt real at first. It had been a moment of fleeting gratitude, Jake assumed, a promise made in the haze of near death, perhaps something that would be forgotten in the aftermath of the accident. But when Jonathan's assistant called 2 days later to discuss plans for the cafe, Jake realized that the millionaire had meant every word. "Mr. Hale wants to meet with you and your mother," the assistant had said. "He's made arrangements to help with the funding and design. He's very serious about this." Jake could barely believe it. His mother had nearly cried when he told her, and they both spent the next few weeks poring over plans, talking to architects and interior designers, sketching out ideas for the small but charming cafe that would soon sit on the corner of Main Street. But Jake wasn't just thinking about the cafe. He couldn't shake the thought that there was something more to his encounter with Jonathan Hale. The man had saved his life with his words, promising to make his mother's dream come true. But what if Jake could do more? What if, by working alongside Jonathan, he could help change the man's life, too? Jake had never been one to ask for much, but there was one thing he'd been thinking about since that first meeting with Jonathan. Something more important than his mother's cafe. One evening, after they had finalized the details of the cafe, Jake sat down with his mother at the kitchen table, his notebook open in front of him. He had been toying with an idea for days, one he wasn't sure how to voice. Laura looked at him, the lines of worry still evident on her face, but her eyes were softer now. There was a flicker of hope in her smile, a quiet optimism he hadn't seen in a long time. "Mom," Jake began, his voice quiet. I think I need to talk to Mr. Hale about something else. Laura raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing together thoughtfully. What do you mean, honey? Jake took a deep breath and looked at his mother. It's not just about the cafe. It's about him. About Jonathan. I think he needs help. Laura's expression softened, though she looked puzzled. Help? What kind of help? Jake shifted in his seat, trying to find the right words. He had seen something in Jonathan that others might not have. The millionaire had everything: money, influence, success. But it had become clear to Jake that, in a way, Jonathan was just as lost as anyone else. He was driven by something that wasn't fulfilling him. Jake could see it in his eyes, in the moments when the business talk would fade away, and there would be a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of uncertainty. Jonathan's focus on profit, on expansion, on winning, it had come at a cost. He had no family to speak of, no personal connections beyond the boardroom, and Jake could see the loneliness in him, even when he was surrounded by people. I think Mr. Hale needs to learn how to care about people again, Jake said slowly. He's so focused on his business that he's forgotten what really matters. I want to help him see that. I want to show him what it's like to do something that's not about making money. I think I can help him see that, Mom. Laura looked at him, her eyes wide. It wasn't that she didn't believe in her son. Jake was bright beyond his years, but asking a millionaire, a man who had built an empire, to reconsider his entire approach to life, it seemed impossible. And yet, when she saw the earnestness in Jake's eyes, she realized this wasn't just a child's whim. Jake believed in something bigger. He believed that the world could be better, and he wasn't going to stop at just saving a life or making his mother's dream come true. He wanted to make a real difference. Are you sure about this, Jake? Laura asked gently. You don't even know what it would mean to work with someone like him. Jake nodded firmly. I'm sure. I want to help. He helped us, and now it's my turn to help him. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent pondering his decision, Jake called Jonathan's assistant and asked for a meeting. When he arrived at Jonathan's office, a sleek, glass-walled tower at the heart of the city, he felt the weight of the moment. Everything about this world felt foreign to him. The polished floors, the expensive furnishings, the people who moved like they owned the world. But Jake was determined. Jonathan greeted him in his office, and Jake couldn't help but notice how tired the man looked. His normally crisp suit seemed slightly disheveled, his eyes carrying a weight that wasn't there the first time they'd met. I'm glad you came, Jake, Jonathan said, gesturing for him to sit. What can I do for you today? Jake sat down across from him, nervous but resolute. I've been thinking, he began, about everything that's happened since the accident. About what you've done for us, helping Mom with the cafe. But I think there's more you can do. More that you need to do. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. Go on. I don't think you're really living, Mr. Hale, Jake said. You've spent your whole life building this empire, but you've forgotten what it means to care about people. You've forgotten that business can be about helping others, not just making money. I think you need to learn that again. Jonathan blinked, taken aback by the directness of Jake's words. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially not by a child. But there was something in Jake's tone, something that cut through the layers of business jargon and power plays that had defined Jonathan's life for so long. It was honesty, raw and unfiltered. What are you suggesting, Jake? Jonathan asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. Jake sat up straighter. I want to help you. I want to work with you, not just on business stuff, but on real stuff, on helping people, on making decisions that aren't just about profits. I think together, we can change the way you do business. It's time to stop focusing on winning and start focusing on what really matters. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. It wasn't like anything he'd ever heard before. No one ever told him to slow down and think about the people his decisions affected. Everyone in his world wanted something from him, and they spoke in numbers, in percentages, in what was next. But Jake? Jake wanted to teach him something bigger, something more meaningful. I'll give you a chance, Jonathan said finally, his voice tinged with something new, respect, perhaps, or maybe curiosity. You got my attention. Jake smiled, relieved that his request had been heard. I'll do my best, Mr. Hale. I promise. In the weeks that followed, Jake's presence in Jonathan's life started to take on a new rhythm. At first, Jonathan wasn't entirely sure what to expect from the arrangement. After all, Jake was just a child. How could he, with his innocence and youthful wisdom, possibly have the insight to make a difference in Jonathan's high-powered, cutthroat world? But as time passed, Jonathan found himself rethinking his approach to business. And it was Jake, of all people, who was the catalyst for that shift. Their meetings, though irregular, became something Jonathan began to look forward to. Jake didn't waste time with pleasantries or small talk. He dove right into the heart of the issues Jonathan was grappling with, offering suggestions that were simple yet profound. There were no sales pitches, no hidden agendas. Jake just wanted to help Jonathan understand something bigger than profits and margins. One morning, Jonathan invited Jake to the office to discuss the upcoming launch of a new tech product. It was a major initiative, one that had the potential to redefine the company's market presence. Jonathan had spent months planning it, and everything had been carefully calculated down to the last detail. The meeting room was filled with his senior executives, their faces stern, as they outlined the numbers and projections that accompanied the product's release. Jake, sitting quietly at the table, took in the room with a mixture of curiosity and cautious observation. The adults around him spoke in fast-paced, calculated tones, wording contracts, discussing margins, talking about profit estimates like they were discussing the weather. But there was something missing in the conversation, something Jake had noticed from the beginning. When the floor finally opened for questions, Jake raised his hand, his voice steady despite the intimidating atmosphere. "You've all been talking about numbers and profits," he began. "But what about the people who are going to use this product? Have you thought about how this will impact their lives? Or is it just another way to make more money?" The room fell silent. Jonathan felt the weight of Jake's words settle in, his gaze flickering to his executives, who were now looking at each other uncomfortably. It wasn't something they typically discussed in meetings like these. People? Emotions? It was all about the bottom line. But Jake had pointed out a glaring truth, one that Jonathan had long ignored. For a moment, Jonathan considered silencing Jake. After all, this wasn't a child's place to question his business decisions. But instead of dismissing him, Jonathan found himself strangely compelled to listen. "We've done focus groups," one of the senior executives chimed in, trying to defend the product's design. "The feedback's been positive. We're confident the market will respond well." Jake nodded, but his eyes were serious. "But that's just the product. What about the people who can't afford it? Or the ones who might not understand how to use it? What's your plan for them?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jonathan knew Jake wasn't attacking him. He wasn't even questioning the product's value. But the young boy had introduced an element into the conversation that was rarely considered: empathy. Jonathan had been so focused on the technical side, the potential revenue, the trajectory of the company, that he had forgotten about the human element, the very people the product was supposed to serve. Jake's quiet voice had shaken something inside Jonathan, something that had been dormant for years. The more he thought about it, the more he realized Jake was right. The world of tech, of startups and innovation, had become so obsessed with success that they often overlooked the impact on the people who didn't have access, or didn't understand, or didn't benefit. After the meeting, Jonathan took Jake aside, his mind still reeling from the conversation. "You're right," he admitted, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. "I've been so caught up in winning, in beating the competition, that I forgot why I started all of this in the first place." Jake didn't respond right away. He was still processing everything he had heard. He was just a kid, after all, and the idea that he had somehow made Jonathan Hale, one of the wealthiest, most influential men in the country, question his entire approach to business was both humbling and overwhelming. "I'm glad you listened," Jake said after a moment. "I think sometimes you have to stop and think about what really matters, not just the next step." Jonathan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Jake's words sink in. "I've been so focused on what's next," he said quietly. "On growth, on winning. I forgot why I started doing this in the first place. It wasn't just about making money. It was about helping people." From that day forward, Jonathan began making small changes in how he approached his work. His meetings became less about numbers and more about impact. He started asking questions that had never occurred to him before. How will this affect the community? Will this help or harm those who are already struggling? It wasn't a sudden transformation, but there was a shift in his mindset, a realization that his wealth and power didn't mean anything if he wasn't using them for the greater good. Jake, for his part, remained humble, though he couldn't hide his pride at seeing the results of his influence. Every time Jonathan brought up a new initiative or product, he would ask the same questions. How will this help people? Who are we leaving behind? And Jonathan found himself making decisions that reflected a deeper sense of responsibility. The company began to take on projects that prioritized accessibility, sustainability, and inclusivity. The board members, initially skeptical of Jake's influence, started to see the merit in these changes. Slowly, the company's culture began to reflect the values Jonathan was learning to embrace. Jake had become more than just an advisor to Jonathan. He had become a partner, someone whose perspective was invaluable. And it wasn't just in business matters. Jonathan began to open up more personally, sharing his struggles and uncertainties with Jake, who listened with a maturity that surprised him. It wasn't long before Jonathan realized that Jake had taught him more than just business strategy. He had taught him what it meant to be human again, to live with purpose, to see the world beyond the balance sheets. One afternoon, as they sat in Jonathan's office reviewing a new charity initiative that the company had decided to launch, Jonathan turned to Jake with a look of genuine gratitude. "You've changed everything for me, Jake," he said quietly. "I don't know where I'd be without you." Jake shrugged, his eyes twinkling. "I just helped you remember what was important. You did the rest." Jonathan smiled, a rare and genuine smile. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path, not just in business, but in life. And as he looked at Jake, he realized that the boy had given him something priceless, a new way of seeing the world. As Jonathan's company began shifting its focus toward more socially responsible ventures, he started to feel the weight of the changes he had made. It wasn't just about the bottom line anymore. It was about the legacy he was leaving behind. But even as he made strides in his business, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from his personal life. He had been so focused on building his empire, so consumed by his work, that he had neglected the human side of things for too long. His relationships, or lack thereof, had suffered. His first marriage had ended in heartbreak when his ex-wife, Claire, couldn't handle the constant demands of his career. The pain of losing Sophie, their daughter, had been a wound that never fully healed. He rarely spoke about her anymore, and the guilt of not being there when she needed him the most still gnawed at his conscience. It wasn't until one evening, when he was reviewing a new community outreach initiative Jake had suggested, that Jonathan felt the loneliness more acutely than ever. He was sitting alone in his spacious, modern home, the city lights twinkling outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, but the emptiness inside felt unbearable. Jonathan had everything he had ever wanted: money, power, respect, but none of it felt like enough. He was still haunted by the echoes of his past mistakes, by the ghost of Sophie and the broken pieces of his first marriage. He had thought that by focusing solely on his work, he could bury the pain, but it was becoming clear that no amount of success could fill the void in his heart. At that moment, he picked up his phone, scrolling through the contacts. His mind wandered to Claire, his ex-wife, and their daughter, Sophie. He hadn't seen them in years, and the thought of reaching out terrified him. The last time he tried to reconnect, it had ended in a fight. Sophie had been just 3 years old when she was abducted. Claire had never forgiven him for not being there, and even though he had tried, he knew the damage was irreparable. Jonathan set the phone down with a sigh. The guilt, the regret, it all came rushing back. He had thrown himself into his work, into the endless cycle of meetings and deals, to avoid facing the reality of his fractured family. But now, as he looked at the life he had built, he couldn't ignore the fact that he was still missing something vital. And that something wasn't in the products or the wealth or the recognition. It was in the connections, the relationships, and the people he had lost along the way. Jake's voice echoed in his mind. "It's not just about winning, Mr. Hale. It's about helping people, about making things right." Jonathan had spent so long building walls around his heart, convincing himself that the price of success was isolation. But now, with Jake's influence, he was beginning to understand that real success wasn't measured by stock prices or acquisition deals. It was measured by the impact you had on others, by the people you cared for and who cared about you in return. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the office early, still weighed down by the weight of his thoughts. Jake was already there, sitting at the conference table with a notebook and a half-empty cup of coffee. The boy was becoming more and more like a trusted advisor, someone Jonathan not only relied on for business matters, but someone who made him reconsider the very nature of success. Jake looked up when Jonathan entered the room, offering him a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Hale. I've got some new ideas for the charity initiative we talked about." Jonathan nodded, but his mind wasn't on the charity plans. He had made a decision, one he knew would change the course of his life. "Jake," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, "I need to make things right." Jake raised an eyebrow, sensing the gravity in Jonathan's tone. "What do you mean?" Jonathan took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about my past, about Claire and Sophie. I've spent so many years convincing myself that business was all that mattered, that I could fix everything with success. But I was wrong. I've neglected the things that truly matter. I need to fix my relationship with my daughter, and I need to do it now. I've let too much time slip by." Jake sat back in his chair, processing Jonathan's words. "You mean you want to reach out to them?" Jonathan nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how they'll react. I don't know if they'll want to see me, but I have to try. I've been avoiding it for too long." Jake studied Jonathan for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "It's never easy to make amends, Mr. Hale, but it's the right thing to do. You can't keep running from it." Jonathan nodded again, this time with a sense of resolve. He had spent so long hiding from the past, burying his emotions under layers of business deals and boardroom meetings. But now, for the first time in years, he felt a surge of clarity. The success he had built didn't matter without the people who had once been his foundation, his family. His ex-wife and daughter were the missing pieces he had long ignored, and now he knew he had to face them. "I don't even know where to start," Jonathan admitted, the weight of his guilt pressing down harder than ever. "I've made so many mistakes. I don't even know if they'll want to hear me out." Jake, despite his age, spoke with an understanding beyond his years. "The first step is reaching out. They might be angry, they might not even want to see you. But if you don't try, you'll never know." Jonathan let out a long breath, running his fingers over his chin. "You're right. I've been hiding from this for far too long, waiting for the right time, the right moment, but there's no perfect time for this. I just need to do it." Jake stood up from the table, a quiet but determined energy in his voice. "You can do this, and I think they'll respect you more for trying, even if it's difficult." Jonathan looked at the boy, surprised by the depth of his support. Jake wasn't just offering business advice. He was offering emotional guidance, something Jonathan never expected from someone so young. It was almost like Jake had an intuitive understanding of the human condition, of what really mattered beyond the spreadsheets and the numbers. "I'll need some time," Jonathan said, his voice strained. "But I'm going to do it. I'm going to reach out to Claire and see if I can make things right with Sophie." Jake smiled, a quiet, confident grin. "You got this." Later that afternoon, Jonathan made the call. He dialed Claire's number hesitantly, his stomach twisting as the phone rang. When she picked up, there was a brief silence before she spoke, her voice cool, guarded. "Jonathan," she said, the name hanging between them like an old wound. "What do you want?" I want to apologize," Jonathan began, his voice trembling. "I know it's been years, and I don't expect everything to be fixed just like that. But I need you to know that I've been thinking about everything, about Sophie, about you, and I realize now that I made terrible mistakes. I wasn't there when I should have been, and I've been running from that. But I want to make things right, Claire. I want to be a part of Sophie's life again. If you'll let me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jonathan held his breath, not knowing what to expect. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice softer now, but still wary. "You can't just erase the past, Jonathan," she said. "Sophie, she's older now. She's been through a lot. But I won't stop you from trying. You have to prove that you're serious about this, though. You have to show her that you really care." Jonathan felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. It wasn't the warm reunion he had hoped for, but it was a step, a fragile thread reaching across the chasm of time and hurt. I'll I'll do whatever it takes, Jonathan promised, his voice steady now. Thank you. As he ended the call, Jonathan felt a weight lift off his chest. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was the beginning of something new. The first real step toward healing the rift between him and his family. The days following Jonathan's emotional decision to reconnect with his past were a blur of mixed emotions. Hope, uncertainty, and a growing sense of responsibility. Despite his success in the business world, the path he was now walking was unlike any he had ever faced before. It was messy, uncharted, and far more personal than any of his previous ventures. But it felt right. For the first time in years, Jonathan was putting something ahead of his career, something that truly mattered: his family. Jonathan had made the call to Claire, and she had agreed to meet, but there were still countless obstacles ahead. He hadn't seen Sophie since she was 3 years old, and even though time had passed, the memory of her disappearance and the pain of losing her was still a raw wound. It was impossible to know how she had changed, what kind of person she had become, or if she would even want to see him after all these years. The fear of rejection hung over him like a storm cloud. But that morning, something inside Jonathan told him he had to follow through. He couldn't keep running from his past. He needed to face it head-on, no matter how difficult. He knew he was going to have to prove his sincerity to Claire, to Sophie, and to himself. After his meeting with Jake earlier in the week, Jonathan had felt more determined than ever to try. The boy had been his rock, providing insights and clarity when Jonathan had felt lost. He wasn't sure how much longer he could rely on Jake's wisdom. After all, Jake was just a child, but for now, it felt as if the boy was the one person who truly understood him. Jonathan wasn't accustomed to opening up to anyone, let alone a young boy, but Jake had been there for him when no one else had, offering the kind of emotional intelligence that Jonathan had lacked for so long. That morning, Jonathan got into his car, making his way to the small cafe where he and Claire had agreed to meet. It was a quiet place, tucked away on a side street. Nothing fancy, nothing like the high-end venues he usually frequented. But that's what made it perfect. This wasn't about impressing Claire with wealth or status. This was about something deeper, about showing up, being vulnerable, and acknowledging the mistakes that had driven them apart. When he arrived, Claire was already seated at a corner table. She looked different, older, more weary, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't changed. That same guardedness, that wariness. She was still the woman who had once loved him, but time had built walls between them that were not easily dismantled. Jonathan took a seat across from her, feeling the weight of the years between them. Neither of them spoke for a few moments, the silence heavy with all the unspoken words that had accumulated over the years. Finally, Claire broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. "You've really changed, haven't you?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for signs of sincerity. Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. "I have," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm not the man I was when we were together. I've spent so many years hiding from my mistakes, telling myself that I could fix everything with success. But I was wrong. I wasn't there when I should have been, and I want to make that right. If you'll let me." Claire studied him for a long time, as if weighing his words, considering whether to believe him. Jonathan could feel the judgment in her eyes, the skepticism. She had every right to be doubtful. He had failed her and Sophie, and no apology could erase the years of pain and absence. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Jonathan," she said quietly, her voice tinged with sorrow. "You weren't there when Sophie needed you, and I don't know if I can ever forget how much you abandoned us." Jonathan's heart clenched. He had expected this, but hearing it out loud made it feel all the more real. The guilt, the regret, it was like a constant weight on his chest. But this was the truth. This was the reality he had to face. "I know," he replied, his voice raw. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I've been living with that guilt every day. But I can't change what happened in the past, Claire. I can only show you that I'm ready to try, to be a father to Sophie, to be there for her. If she'll let me?" Claire's eyes softened, though the pain was still there, etched deeply into her features. "You can't just expect Sophie to forgive you either. She's grown up without you, and she has her own life now. You can't just waltz back in and think everything will be fine." Jonathan nodded, understanding her hesitance. I know. I'm not asking for things to go back to how they were. I just want a chance to prove myself, to be part of her life again, if she'll let me. For a long time, Claire said nothing. She just sat there, her gaze distant, lost in thought. Jonathan waited patiently, knowing that nothing could rush this process. The wounds were deep, and healing wasn't something that could happen overnight. Finally, Claire spoke again, her voice softer now, but still cautious. I don't know if Sophie will want to see you. She's had a lot of time to grow, and she's angry. She's hurt, but I'll talk to her. I'll give you a chance to explain yourself. But you have to understand, Jonathan, that this isn't just about you and me. It's about Sophie. She's the one who's been through the most. Jonathan nodded, feeling a surge of hope mixed with the understanding of how difficult this would be. He had no illusions that this would be easy, but it was a start, a real start. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving me this chance. I won't take it for granted. As Jonathan left the cafe, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Hope, fear, excitement, and dread. He had made the first step toward mending the broken pieces of his family, but there was still so much work to be done. Sophie was a stranger to him now, a young woman who had grown up without him. How would she react to his apology? Would she even want him in her life again? But for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't just chasing success anymore. He was chasing redemption, and that he realized was worth every bit of the risk. The days following Jonathan's meeting with Claire were a blur. It felt like time was moving in slow motion, the moments stretching out with anticipation and uncertainty. He had no idea what to expect when it came to Sophie. Would she remember him? Would she even want to speak to him after all these years of silence? Jonathan spent countless hours preparing himself mentally. He rehearsed what he would say to her, but no matter how many times he practiced, it always felt like he was missing something, like the words were never enough to make up for the time lost. What could he say to a young woman who had grown up without a father? How could he explain the years of pain, the mistakes, the regrets? And how could he make her believe that he was truly there for her now? Claire had agreed to let Sophie decide if she wanted to meet him. Jonathan hadn't expected her to immediately accept his presence in her life. After all, Claire's consent didn't guarantee Sophie's. He had no idea what kind of life she had lived or how she would react to the stranger who was once her father. The call came late one afternoon. Jonathan had just finished a long day at the office, going through numbers and reports, when the phone buzzed on his desk. It was Claire. Jonathan. Her voice was cautious, but there was a strange warmth in it. Sophie has agreed to meet with you. It's not going to be easy, but she's willing to talk. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure whether to feel relief or anxiety, but the news was undeniably a step forward. Claire had warned him that Sophie was still angry, that the pain of abandonment was something she had carried for years. And though Claire had given her blessing, Jonathan knew that Sophie's acceptance would be the true test of whether his journey toward redemption had a chance. When the day came for the meeting, Jonathan felt like he was walking into the unknown. He arrived at the cafe early, hoping to gather his thoughts before seeing Sophie for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The small cafe where he and Claire had met was quiet, cozy, almost the same as before, but now it felt like a completely different place. He wasn't just walking into a familiar setting. He was about to face the child he had failed to protect, the daughter who had been stolen from him in more ways than one. As he sat down at the table, his nerves began to rise. He adjusted his suit, fidgeting slightly, unsure of what to do with his hands. He didn't know what Sophie looked like now, whether she would still resemble the little girl he remembered, with her bright eyes and infectious laugh, or if she had grown into a completely different person. What would she think of him? Would she even recognize him? The door opened, and Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as a young woman stepped in. She looked around the cafe before her eyes settled on him. Sophie. She was taller than he remembered, her features more mature, but there was something familiar about her expression, something that tugged at his heart. She wasn't the little girl who had vanished from his life. She was an adult now, a woman who had been shaped by years of her own experiences, pain, and loss. Sophie walked toward the table, her eyes steady, but her face unreadable. Jonathan stood up to greet her, but she didn't offer her hand. "I'm still angry," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Angry at you for not being there, for leaving us behind without even trying. But I don't know. I don't know what to do with all that anger anymore." Jonathan's stomach tightened. He had expected this, but hearing her speak so plainly about the hurt he had caused was still a punch to the gut. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I know that I can't undo what happened, but I'm here now, Sophie. I want to be here, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you." Sophie looked at him, studying him with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "I don't know if I can just forgive you, Jonathan. It's not that easy. It's not something you can just fix by showing up." "I know," Jonathan said, his voice tight with emotion. "I've spent my life thinking that I could fix everything by making money, by building something that looks successful on the outside. But none of that matters if I didn't show up for you. I can't undo the past. I can't make it right, but I want you to know that I'm not running anymore." The words felt raw, honest. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt that he was speaking from his heart, not from a place of shame, but from a place of accountability. And Sophie, for all her anger, seemed to soften at his sincerity. "You don't have to fix everything," she said after a long pause. "But you do have to show up. You have to be consistent." Jonathan nodded, understanding. He wasn't asking for her forgiveness yet. He knew that wasn't something he could demand. But he was ready to show her, to prove to her, that he could be the father she needed, even if it took time. "I'll be here, Sophie," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "I'll be here every step of the way, even if it's hard, even if you don't want to talk. I'll be here." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, the flicker of emotion in her eyes betraying her guarded exterior. "I'm not sure where we go from here," she said quietly. "But maybe we can figure it out. Together." Jonathan's heart soared at the words, but he didn't let himself get ahead of the moment. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a breakthrough, a crack in the walls that had separated them for so long. Over the next several months, Jonathan and Sophie continued to meet, slowly rebuilding their relationship. They spent time together, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Jonathan continued to show up, to be present in ways he hadn't been before. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, missteps, and moments where it felt like they were back at square one. But with each passing day, there was more trust, more understanding. One evening, after a particularly quiet but meaningful dinner, Sophie looked at Jonathan, her expression softer than it had been in years. "Thank you," she said, her voice almost shy. "For not giving up." Jonathan's eyes welled with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a chance," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. And in that moment, Jonathan realized that redemption wasn't just about fixing what had been broken. It was about showing up, being vulnerable, and continuing to walk the path, even when it felt impossible. It wasn't the end of their journey, but it was a new beginning. As Jonathan left the cafe that evening, a sense of peace settled over him. The road ahead would still be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, he knew that he was on the right path, not just for his business, but for his family. He wasn't just rebuilding a relationship with Sophie, he was rebuilding himself. And that was enough. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.